I want to talk more about this mass psychosis. This do you believe that this is an organized mass psychosis? All these steps that you put about isolation, taking away basic freedoms, and then offering up one individual single solution to this. And this is what has sort of fueled this, what's very obvious to people, that there's a lot of people that are not acting well. They're not acting normal. They are attacking people that seem to be ideologically opposed to whatever is going on, and they're marching in lockstep with the authoritarians. And they're doing it like you would, like Stockholm syndrome or something. It's very strange. Do you think this is an organized thing? Do you think this is just what happens when you have a massive group of people that are dealing with an incredibly tense and anxiety-ridden event like a pandemic, where no one knows what the solution is, and a lot of people are terrified of just everyday life? And then all of a sudden something like this comes along, and those are the people that are more easily manipulated, and they fall in line together because there's sort of a tribal aspect to this type of thinking and behavior, and you find support from other people that are equally afraid.
You know, the mass psychosis clearly is focused on pillar number 4. That was the last pillar that I presented to the Americans in November of 2020 in the U.S. Senate. This is before the vaccines came out, and that is vaccination. Listen, vaccination should play a role. I've taken all the vaccines. My kids have taken all the vaccines. I went to India. I took extra vaccines. So you don't have any problem with vaccines. What had happened is, I want to say by April of 2020, it was clear that the vaccine development program was far more advanced than we ever could have imagined. How could we have actually figured out the neutralizing antibodies and have the sequence to the spike protein and have all that ready to go? Have already figured out how to load it into messenger or adenoviral DNA. How do we actually get that to run? Remember, there are 24 of these platforms. They had all previously failed except for patirisan. A lot of people don't know this. There is a messenger RNA product. I can use it as a cardiologist called patirisan. It's a small interfering messenger RNA that we use to treat amyloidosis. But the previous trials of gene transfer technology, which is what these are, were normally to replace a missing protein. So, for instance, I'm a cardiologist. I treat a condition called Fabry's disease. It affects the heart. There was a messenger RNA program to basically replace the missing enzyme, alpha-galactosidase. But in this case, to take these platforms and say, you know what, these are ready to go. We're just going to insert the code for the spike protein, which is now what we've learned is the lethal part of COVID-19. The ball of the virus, the nucleocapsid, that beach ball, is relatively harmless. What causes all the damage is the spine or the spicule on the surface. Everyone knows a cartoon of the virus. That's called the spike protein. 1,200 amino acids, about a dozen glycosylation sites. It has some homology, by the way, to HIV. And so a lot of people don't know this. But one of the original antigenic vaccines that was tested in Australia exposed that HIV epitope. It turned everybody in the trial HIV positive who took a COVID-19 vaccine in Australia. These young people were outraged. And so this was on the internet. It was quickly suppressed. But if anybody wants to type this in right now, you can actually learn that one of the very first vaccines tried in Australia actually turned everybody HIV positive. They didn't have HIV, but there was a molecular trickery that was going on. Having said this, now when we look back, when we look at the books, Popper, Bregan, Robert F. Kennedy, and now Atlas, it's pretty clear that this was planned. And it was planned, and the elements of the mass psychosis are clearly planned. In fact, the elements of the mass psychosis are in the Johns Hopkins planning document. They had that up on their website since 2017. Once the pandemic hit in March of 2020, they actually published it in the peer-reviewed literature. You can see how it was all done. That's how the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health had the death count up on CNN and MSNBC and Fox as a scoreboard. Do you remember the scoreboard was number of cases and deaths? How do they get that, Joe? Come on, I fill out death certificates every day. Do you know the average death certificate comes to me 6 weeks after the death? How are they getting these deaths, instantaneous numbers, picking up every day? It was extraordinary what Americans saw. So
how were they getting that?
To this day, we don't know. To this day, we don't know. All we know on the CDC website is the CDC website says that about 90% of the deaths that have occurred with COVID-19 have been associated with significant comorbidities, meaning other major problems that were in the proximal pathway to death. The Italians have just recoded all of their deaths. They say 97% of the Italian deaths, meaning someone had heart failure, advanced lung disease, kidney disease, on dialysis, advanced cancer. A good example was Colin Powell. Colin Powell just died recently. He was in his 80s. He was fully vaccinated, and he died of multiple myeloma, but he was also COVID positive. And so the question is, how much of the COVID did he die of, and how much of the multiple myeloma? Larry King died the same way. I mean, we don't have to go far to find well-known personalities where this happened. The point is, the deaths were coming in quickly. It may be the fact that the deaths, the vast majority of them occurred in the hospital. So we didn't have to have this prolonged outpatient, death certificate signing, and things were mainlined from the hospital. We know President Trump's authorization for the testing became the way that the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health got the scoreboard for positive tests. And that executive order said all the laboratories and all the departments of public health doing testing will report positive tests to the center, the Johns Hopkins Center. And they did. That means Quest, LabCorp, Abbott. All of them started to have a flow of tests. Interestingly, there was no reconciliation for duplicates. So if you would have went to one testing center and put your name as Joe Rogan, and you went to another testing center and said your name is, Jose Rogan or something, you'd come in as two different tests. There was never any reconciliation. And we understood over time that the number of tests positive was, in a sense, padded. It was padded by duplicate tests. It was padded by this idea of asymptomatic testing. So one of the big discoveries in 2020 is that the virus is not spread asymptomatically. It's only spread from sick person to susceptible person. This is a very important. 2 major papers, one by Cao from China, one by Madewell, nailed this down. Once we learned that asymptomatic testing wasn't happening, it became clear the Swedes were right. Scott Atlas was right. Well, the only thing we needed to do was just keep sick people at home. They were the only people who needed to quarantine. And well people could go do what they were going to do. Somebody can't walk into a workplace with no symptoms and give the virus to somebody else. It doesn't happen.
The problem is with that